most important change that came as a fleet leader was understanding the concept of first who and then what. Understanding that you really need to have a great culture in a fleet organization, really in any kind of business or enterprise, but I think it's even more important in fleet because in the absence of that great culture, you will struggle to find the right motivations and the right incentives for people to get their work done. So this concept of first who, then what, right? In fleet, we know what our job is, we know what our role is for the most part, but being willing to get the right people on the team was really sort of a pivotal change. And to give you an example of what I mean, I remember I had an employee who was a great worker, and he got a lot done, and he accomplished a lot of work, but at the same time, he was unreliable. So while he might pick up extra shifts and he might do a lot, sometimes the quality suffered, or he would miss a shift entirely. And then that would have this trickle-down effect that was really negative for all of the other employees. And the other employees, frankly, did not appreciate him very much, for that reason. And so keeping him around as long as I did, because I was operating from this concept of scarcity of I don't have enough people to do the work, and he does a lot of work, actually hurt me, right? In the long run, once I realized, no, I need to let him go and move on, I found that I was able to build a better culture. Maybe I didn't have another worker who did as much work as he did, but the sort of the sum of the whole was much greater, and that consistency really drove home. And as a team, we were a much better team. So first who, then what, and use those sort of key people in the organization to build the culture. Do they have the values? Do they have the mindset that you want them to have? And yeah, that's sort of the biggest change I'd see. That's, if I was going out and starting a fleet tomorrow, that's how I'd start one.
For me, I think the most pivotal thing was when leadership tracks really started getting introduced at conferences. So it started clear back at GFX in 2018. We got a really good presentation, and then from there, just really concentrating on getting better as a leader, as a manager, and leading your people and your fleets. For me, it was all about that leadership track, at a random GFX that really, for me, changed things, honestly.
Yeah, we like to keep everybody interactive in the class, so we always like to ask questions, also use realistic scenarios too during our trainings, and that's how we can keep all of our attendees actually engaged. It allows them to have conversations with us, but also with others within the classroom environments. So therefore everybody is kind of still peppy and ready to continue to learn because we're able to use those real-time scenarios and people can build that bond.
I would have to say it was a former supervisor. He wanted me to be his bulldog, and that didn't work out so well. We had to come together and figure out exactly what works. That was a long time ago. That was in the Air Force. Yeah, things have been a lot different. They take a more personal approach. You get to know the people. You get to understand where they're coming from, who they are, and in the military, they come from all over the place. So that was a big turning point for me.
It was probably back when I was in the Air Force, coming up through the ranks. I had some really good mentors throughout my Air Force career, and I think they all really played a pivotal part in creating me as a fleet manager. When I was with the state of Washington, after I retired, that was my first public fleet job I had. It was with the state of Washington, and the fleet manager there, I came in as the fleet coordinator, and he really took me under his wing and taught me a lot about how to manage a public fleet. So I would say Brian really had the most influence on my career.
So I think there was two moments for me that really shaped how I approach leadership, and maybe pivotal for me is my own development, but then pivotal to my approach to how we're doing leadership with fleets. One was, for my own personal development, was really committing to this idea of building an intentional culture. I've talked a lot about this 10% check that we offer everybody at their 60-day mark. There was a day in 2021, shortly after we all got back from COVID, where I basically gave a 10% check to the entire company. I mean, I was ready to start over if we needed to, but I'd been talking about, hey, this is where we're going, this is what we believe. And I gave everybody basically 10% of their annual salary on a Friday and says, if you're still with me, this is the direction you want to go and you buy into this, then I'll see you here on Monday. And if not, no judgment. I totally encourage you to really consider this. But I was ready to be like the only guy coming in on Monday, ready to answer the phones, start over if I needed to, rehire anybody I needed to, because I was that committed to the vision that I had, the values that I was building, the purpose we had. So it was full buy-in at that point. I had one guy take the check out of about 35 people. And that's when I knew I had everybody, they were bought in. When I think about my approach to fleet leadership, There was a moment, we were actually at a conference just like this. I think I was teaching about 5 dysfunctions of a team. And as I was teaching about this, after the class, somebody came up to me. She's from a town down in Arizona, and she says, you know, Josh, I don't think you understand just what you're doing here, because nobody has ever taught us about this stuff. Nobody has taken the time to invest in us like this. Like, all of our leaders get to go to conferences like this and learn about leadership and learn about how to build a team, but not us in Fleet. And it taught me something really powerful, was that oftentimes we're kind of neglected. We get thrown into situations in Fleet and we have to learn on the fly and adapt and grow, which we're really good at. But sometimes it takes intentionality and getting really clear about how do we build a healthy team? How do we do leadership? What are ways that we have effective one-on-ones and really build a great organization beyond just the nuts and bolts of how to run a fleet, but how do we lead a fleet? So that was a pretty pivotal moment when she came up to me and shared that.
Public sector fleets will continue to face, frankly, the same challenge that they have been facing. Single biggest, there are many, but ultimately it'll be about replacement funding, just as it's always been. The EV phenomenon, let's say, has really kind of, exasperated that issue. Most public sector fleets simply don't have the resources that they need to fund many of the initiatives that they need, training, hiring, and so forth and so on, but certainly not appropriate replacement funding. And there's a negative trickle-down effect of not replacing your assets properly. Again, EVs, they only compound that issue, because you need more money to properly replace assets and to put in infrastructure and so forth and so on. While I could pick out a couple of different issues, tech shortages and other, they all kind of roll up into sort of the lack of resources that government will have, or the struggle to attain resources. And the biggest one that will impact and have the most trickle-down impact into the rest of the program will be being able to replace fleets' assets on time.
We're seeing a lot of it right now with, the brain drain, right? You're getting a lot of people retiring. They're losing that institutional knowledge. Fleet managers now are so much more reliant, on consulting and other fleet managers, because some of that knowledge is being lost. So I think that's going to continue to be a challenge, and I would just encourage people to go out and network and really look at conferences and trainings and try to get some of that knowledge back.
I think the biggest challenge is going to be when it comes down to sustainability and fiscal realities. What I mean by that is when we talk about like all of our alternative fuel options, and it leads into replacement planning and projections. We need to be really mindful as leaders to review how often certain vehicles, like electric vehicles, need to be replaced. They can be replaced a little bit longer, or for a longer time than a standard fuel vehicle, right? What I'm getting at is we just need to be aware and use our data to help us project that idea.
There's so many things. So there's going to be technology changes. There's going to be potential shortages for procurement. There's going to be shortages for costs because taxes and things of that nature. How do you prepare for it? You make sure you have your plan. You have to have your plan. You have to stick to your plan. You have to engage your leaders and make sure that they understand your plan. You have to stick to it. Replacements on the correct cycle will solve a lot of problems. So focus on 1 or 2 or 3 things, but stay on course.
I think it's going to be technician shortages, and what the fleet managers need to do is they need to get into the trade schools and high schools and kind of grow their own, set up internships with the young adults coming out of either college or high school, and pretty much growing your own technicians. I think there's some advantages to that. Yeah, you're not going to have them well trained out of the box, but putting them with trained technicians before they retire is going to give them all the skills they need to carry on and make the fleet successful.
I think one of the biggest challenges that, especially in public sector fleet, they're going to face in the next 5 years is really around AI adoption. We're seeing the private industry rushing towards AI, whereas on the public sector side, natural public sector reaction is security and compliance and stability. So we're already seeing policies coming out about you're not allowed to use AI, you're not allowed to do any of this stuff. And we're gonna see this shift, and this has happened before. The public sector starts falling behind the private sector from a technology adoption standpoint, especially as more and more technology platforms are rushing towards AI. They're gonna be at a disadvantage because they can't use some of these technology platforms. Things that should make them more efficient and more effective, which every government fleet should want, IT is going to prohibit them from being able to develop it. Now, hopefully that'll change soon, but I was just at a conference last week, and these policies are getting just put out en masse, like, hey, you can't have these note takers, you can't use these tools because of this fear of data security and things like that. It'll catch up. Hopefully it'll catch up sooner than later, but I do think it's going to put us at a disadvantage in the public sector side of things for a little while, especially with just how fast things are moving towards AI.